from the garage, and it smelled like roadkill.
Discovery of 3 bodies inside Weldon's home.
He does have a kind heart. He really does.
These days, you don't know who you live next to. Anyone could be anybody next door.
A young woman disappears after an online date, later found brutally dismembered. Now, court documents reveal bizarre items found at the alleged crime scene. Are they connected? And what do the accused killers have to say?
You wouldn't ever think that you'd see your best friend on a missing poster.
They'll be able to get into her Facebook account. They'll be able to get into all of her social media.
She's out there potentially abducted because she is not one to just leave and not let people know where she's going.
Yes, I need a police and ambulance.
A woman calls 911.
My husband's been shot.
Who shot him, ma'am?
I did.
Was he killed because he bought video porn?
And good evening, everybody. I'm Rita Cosby in for Ashley Banfield. This is Crime and Justice. Tonight, the man with his own house of horrors is connected to 2 other disgusting crimes. Stuart Weldon was arrested back in May for kidnapping the woman in his car. And then police found the bodies of 3 other women at his home.
The first time that I smelled the stench was Wednesday evening when the garage door was open completely. That's when the stench came out. And it was from the garage, and it smelled like roadkill, something that died on the road and was wet in it. And myself and 5 other people was like, oh my God, this is a really bad smell.
And we still do not know how they died or whether Weldon killed them. But now we know that he has been linked by DNA evidence to 2 separate sexual assaults. A woman at a homeless shelter back in 2009 and a second woman who came forward last year. Tonight, Weldon's only charged for that kidnapping, and Weldon has pleaded not guilty. But does the evidence suggest he has a history of targeting women, and will he be held responsible? I want to bring in our panel on this. On the phone, we have Stephanie Barry. She's a reporter for The Republican and also Mass Live. Also, former NYPD detective and law enforcement consultant Tom Verney and defense attorney Brian Claypool. Let me bring in Stephanie first. This started with a routine traffic stop. Take us from there, Steph.
Sure. So on May 27th, Stuart Weldon was pulled over during a traffic stop. It didn't go well. He fled from police. They ended up cornering him. He ran the cruiser, and they had to wrestle him to the ground. So on that day, the woman in the car, who was his live-in girlfriend and mother of his children, reported that he had been holding her against her will and abusing her sexually and physically. So he was charged with that crime. 3 days later, his mother, with whom he lived at this house of horrors that you described, called police and said there was a foul smell emanating from somewhere on her property. So police went there on May 30th and subsequently discovered the bodies of 3 dead women in the house and around the property.
So they find the bodies of these women. Where does it stand right now in terms of identifying them? And Stephanie, how long do they believe those remains were there of these 3 separate women?
Well, hard to tell. So in terms of how long they had been there and how they died, that has not yet been released. It's still in the hands of the state medical examiner's office, and it's unclear when that information will be made public. But I can tell you that they were in various states of decomposition, and at least one of them was found, her skeletal remains were found buried underneath a shed.
Stephanie, describe how they finally put him together with some of these other cases, because, and I'm going to get to it in a moment, but there's a long rap sheet. But tell us how they sort of pinned him now back to these other cases where it seems like justice was never served for these poor women.
Yeah, so the timing of that gets a little tricky. So stay with me for a minute. But so the Weldon case becomes very high profile. The search becomes high profile. At the crime scene, the investigators in early June were talking, and one of the state crime lab employees said, "I think this man's name rings a bell." And I think there was a case out of Chicopee, which is a neighboring city for Springfield. So they called over to Chicopee police and said, fax us over this whole file. So as an addendum to that file is a CODIS report, a DNA match, that matches Stuart Weldon's DNA profile to a 2009 rape and a 2017 rape. So 1 year earlier, a woman went to Chicopee police and said, this man took me to this home. He duct taped my mouth. He tied me up. He raped me repeatedly. And the Chicopee police tried to identify the house, concluded that the crime occurred in Springfield, and said, it's not our jurisdiction, call Springfield. So this latent DNA information was just kind of out there in the wind for a year or longer.
Unbelievable. And I want to put up his rap sheet because it goes on and on and on. And there are just so many things in his history that it took many, many pages. This is just page 1, everybody. Let's show page 2. And then it goes to page 3. And then it goes to page 4. It is an unbelievable history that this man had. Tom Burney, you got to be, as a former NYPD detective, you see this. This really stinks to high heaven for so many reasons, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we would refer to sometimes as a menace to society. I mean, this guy's been arrested numerous times in the last couple of decades. He's not that old of a guy. Clearly has a penchant for violence. And now we're at the point where we have multiple people dead. So, you know, clearly something has to be done here. This is, I feel so awful for these families, multiple families that have to go through this, and now we're going to have to sit through a trial with this maniac sitting in the courtroom. You know, luckily, look, they have him, you know, and they're going through the motions, and hopefully it'll come to a conclusion where he is locked away for the rest of his life. There's no death penalty up there, so it's going to be a situation where hopefully he's locked away for decades until he's no longer around.
Let's hope so, especially when you hear about sexual crimes, and you know this in particular, Tom. You've covered a lot of them. There is such a high rate of recidivism when you're dealing with sexual cases, too. So these are what we know
violence
of.
Against the police.
It makes me wonder what else don't we know.
Right, well, and violence against the police, too. He has numerous charges in the past of attacking police officers.
Yes.
Again, there's something clearly not right with this guy, and now it's gotten to the point where we now have multiple fatalities. It's unreal to me.
And what about the finger pointing between the different departments? Because as Stephanie was reporting, one department had some details. Also, there's such a sensitivity with women, too. When something like this, men and women, when they're victims of crime like this, they don't often come forward. They first did, and then they didn't want to go to the other jurisdiction. But it sure sounds like, and I hate to say this, I love the cops,
me too.
It sounds like they dropped the ball in this case.
Yeah, well, this is kind of one of those classic cases where we talk about there's a disconnect, you know, between departments. You know, some of these departments are so siloed and insular from one another, and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing sometimes, and they could be right next door to each other. Yeah. You know, literally right on the same border, but two different departments. And so I would hope that a lesson to be learned here is that these corresponding jurisdictions will talk to each other a little bit more now than they ever did before.
Well, and he's still saying he is not guilty. I want to play a little bit of, this is him, this is Stuart Weldon in court, waiving his rights. Just take a listen.
So you're before the court on docket 18-3571. Sir, that charges you with kidnapping.
Madam Clerk, we would waive a formal reading of the charges. We'd request that a plea of not guilty enter at this time. Mr. Weldon is aware of the nature as well as the elements of the complaint. We are agreed that the bail be set without prejudice at this time. Mr. Weldon has entered his plea of not guilty and looks forward to addressing these charges in the future in court, as well as addressing bail at a later date.
And I want to bring in Brian Claypool, who is with me. Brian, you hear this? You saw how many pages. I mean, we do a lot of stories on the show, but it took 4 pages to show his rap sheet, including assaulting officers. There's so many things in his background. He says he's not guilty. The bodies just happened to show up at the house he lives with his mother, the odor, the timing. Well, how do you defend this guy?
Well, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. It looks bad. It smells bad.
It smells bad in more ways than one, unfortunately.
No pun intended, but proving beyond a reasonable doubt in a courtroom when you have two bodies where the evidence has waned away and has probably been buried in the ground for years, it's going to be hard to have a medical examiner come in and exhume those bodies and take a look at it and try to connect some physical or forensic evidence to this young man, Weldon.
Although you know that sometimes you can find evidence even years later. We've got the DNA. We've got some pretty sophisticated tests. If they can indeed pinpoint it, I mean, the location is pretty significant, Brian. You seem to be discounting that.
Well, look, if the jury trial was going to be based on inference, then you'd get a guilty verdict.
What, it just happened? The bodies just happened to show up in the house? Out of magic, Brian?
You can argue that till the cows come home. But
but a jury is going to hear that and not believe you.
But jurors are also going to be looking at the fact that where is there any DNA evidence connecting Weldon to any of these two women? The tragedy here, too, Rita, bad news, is you don't have those two prior women. You don't have Weldon prosecuted for those other two prior crimes, because much like the Cosby case and Harvey Weinstein, you would have been able to introduce those convictions possibly as evidence in this case as well, which would have helped to get a conviction. So it's still a daunting task to get Weldon convicted.
But you know that there's probably many other cases too. If you look at this guy's rap sheet, and again, we don't know, but there's such a high recidivism rate as we go back to with sexual assaults. And you look at the proclivity and the fact that he's brazen enough to go after officers, Tom. This guy's got such a huge rap sheet. There's probably more, and I bet you they will come up with more details once they determine cause of death. And that may be tough, as you point out, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, he brings up a good point. I mean, you know, each of these cases in upon themselves are standing on their own, facts and evidence, right? So here, as you mentioned, you're going to have to make the connection as to, I think it's not a surprise that these bodies are sitting under his shed in his own backyard. So one could automatically say, oh, well, he's the one who did it, but like you said, you're going to have to connect the dots.
Is he going to blame it on a 70-year-old mother?
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm sure he would. He'd probably throw his mother under the bus if he could.
Probably throw anybody under the bus.
Somebody else could have owned. Who owned the house before him? I don't even think he owns that home.
Well, and somebody else conducted the sexual assaults that they're pointing to him at for also, Brian?
Well, that's where the dots start to get.
You have to try a better one on that one, guys. Stephanie, let me go to you, Stephanie, real quick. On the case of the background of this guy, what I think is so bizarre as we show this rap sheet that Brian and Tom were all looking at it going, whoa, it keeps going. He's described as what, quote, a ladies' man and a nice guy?
Well, I think, one of his childhood friends made that kind of glib remark, and that may have been true when they were teenagers. But I do want to point out, more importantly, the DA's office and the police department has indicated there are more women out there. They're going to bring additional charges. They haven't come yet, but there's a pattern here. And the 2017 victim, who was passed off by Chicopee PD, has since come forward to Springfield PD, and I would be very surprised if she wasn't among a new crop of charges, a new crop of allegations by additional women, up to 10 perhaps, who have very similar stories to tell and very similar profiles. He preyed on women with drug addictions who were vulnerable. So it's going to be a familiar story by the time all is said and done.
Yeah, and certainly a repeated pattern.